My mother's laughter filled the ballroom at the Château Laurier the way it always had. Too loud, too deliberate, designed to make sure every person within 30 feet turned to look. Her? She pressed one hand to her chest and gestured toward me with the other, a glass of white wine tilting between her fingers. She leaned into my brother's shoulder and squeezed. My son is the one who belongs here. He actually did something with his life. My brother straightened. He looked at me the way he had been looking at me his entire life, like a quick calculation followed by a decision. He took one slow step forward, drew his arm back, and struck me across the face with an open palm. The sound cracked off the marble columns. 300 RCMP officers, federal prosecutors, and senior government officials turned as one. The jazz quartet in the corner faltered mid-bar and went silent. My cheek burned. I didn't touch it. I didn't blink. I didn't step back. I stood in my red serge dress uniform with my boots planted on that stone floor and let the moment exist exactly as it was. And then, from somewhere near the front of the crowd, a voice I recognized, graveled with age, quiet as a verdict, cut through the stillness. "Detain that man. He just struck the deputy commissioner." But before I tell you what brought my own family to that exact room, to that exact breaking point, and what happened to them afterward, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what followed, not one person in that ballroom could have predicted. I need to take you back 22 years, to a split-level house in Kanata, the kind of suburb that smells like fresh asphalt and someone else's ambition. The living room was never really a living room. It was a stage my mother had built for an audience she had been auditioning her whole life. I was standing in the doorway the evening my brother announced he had been hired as an associate at a corporate law firm on Bay Street. My mother made a sound I had only ever heard at weddings, that breathless, hands fluttering, I always knew it sound that meant she had won something, though I could never have told you what exactly she was winning. My sister sat on the sectional beside her and smiled the smile of someone who had learned very early to agree with everything. In the corner armchair, my father sat the way he always sat, shoulders folded forward, a heating pad pressed to the base of his spine where 3 discs had been damaged during a foot pursuit 11 years earlier. He was 51 years old and moved like a man of 70. His RCMP dress tunic hung in the hallway, the red sarge he had worn to every formal occasion before the injury took him off active duty. It gathered dust now. My mother had asked him twice to take it down. On the coffee table was an open bottle of Pinot Grigio and my brother's offer letter, printed on paper so heavy it sat flat like it was certain of itself. My mother had already decided where she would tell people he worked and how she would say it. I stepped forward. I said I was not interested in law or finance or any of the options my mother arranged in front of me, the way a card sharp lays out a hand, with the implication that you are lucky to be playing it all. I told her I was applying to the RCMP. The room went very quiet. My mother set down her wine glass with the precise control of someone who is about to stop being controlled. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for bad service and unflattering photographs, and then she pointed at my father's armchair, at him, at the heating pad, at the prescription bottles on the end table, and her voice dropped to something almost gentle, which made it worse. "Is that what you want? Because that is exactly what you get. 22 years of service, and you cannot afford a physiotherapist who takes his insurance. You come home one day, and you never really come home again." My father's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, and then the muscle spasm hit. I could see it move through his shoulders, and he pressed his lips together and said nothing. The pain medication made him slow. The pain itself made him slower. He had not been able to hold his ground in that room for a very long time. My mother turned and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I heard the sound of hangers being raked off the closet rod, that metal scrape, fast and deliberate, like tearing pages out of a book. She came back with 2 contractor bags stuffed with my clothes, my textbooks, my running shoes, and the small framed photograph I kept of my father in his dress uniform at my high school graduation. She set the bags by the front door without ceremony. "If you want to throw your life away chasing some fantasy about being a Mountie," she said, straightening her blouse, "then you don't live in this house." My brother was leaning against the kitchen door frame, arms crossed, not laughing but not laughing. My sister had found something very interesting to look at on her phone. I looked at my father. He had turned in the armchair, his arm extended toward me, his hand shaking, not from nerves, from the nerve damage reaching the way he reached, that specific gesture of his that had always broken me open a little, like he was trying to close a distance he could not physically cross. The spasm took him again, his arm dropped. I picked up the contractor bags. I kicked the front door open and walked out into a November night in Ottawa that smelled like coming snow. I was 19 years old and I had everything I owned in 2 plastic bags. There was a women's shelter on Bronson Avenue with a short-term intake policy for women who were not in immediate crisis but had nowhere to go. I spent 11 days there. The woman at the intake desk did not ask why I had no family to call. She gave me a bottom bunk and a key to a locker. I got a dishwashing job at a diner on Bank Street. The owner, a compact, unsentimental Haitian-Canadian woman named Mrs. Etienne, who had no patience for self-pity and no interest in other people's origin stories, pointed me at the industrial sink on my first morning and told me my shift started at 5:30. I showed up at 5:15 every day. She noticed and said nothing about it, but she started leaving a wrapped sandwich in the walk-in for me at the end of each shift. I ate those sandwiches, and I kept my cash in an envelope taped to the inside of my locker because the locks had a tendency not to hold. 6 weeks after I left my mother's house, I walked into the RCMP recruiting office on Elgin Street. The constable across the desk was young, maybe 5 years older than me. He slid the application package across the metal desk and asked if I had a support system. Family references someone to list as an emergency contact. I told him I had none. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he pushed the forms a little closer and said, carefully, fill these out thoroughly. I did. Before I left Ottawa for the academy, I sat down with an advisor at a TD branch on Spark Street and set up a scheduled automatic transfer, monthly, from my training stipend into a private account linked to a home care agency. The payments would go through regardless of where I was posted. The agency would send a personal support worker to my father's address twice a week, help with meals, physiotherapy exercises, prescription pickup. My mother would never know where the coverage came from. She would assume it was a provincial supplement she did not understand and therefore did not investigate. That was fine. She had always preferred the comfortable assumption over the accurate one. I could not leave him, so I stayed the only way I could, invisible and consistent, like a wire running through the wall that nobody thinks about until the lights stay on. Depot Division in Regina is flat and gray in a way that feels personal, like the prairie itself is evaluating whether you deserve to be there. Cadet training was 6 months. I arrived underweight, sleep-deprived, and already behind the physical baseline that the college athletes and former firefighters around me had spent years building. The troop sergeant assessed me in the first morning formation the way people had been assessing me my entire life. A quick calculation, a decision made before I said a word. She assigned me to the end of the line without explanation. By the end of the first week, I had heard 2 cadets from BC taking quiet bets in the locker room about how long I would last. One said I would not clear the obstacle course standards. The other gave me until week 8. They were not being cruel, exactly. They were being practical, the way athletes file a competitor under not a factor and move on. I lay on my rack that night and let the words settle into me. Then I used them. My mother's voice and their voices ran in the same frequency. You don't belong. You're not built for this. Go home. I had no home to go to. That simplified things considerably. I ran before Reveille every morning. I asked the strongest cadet in the troop, a quiet, deliberate woman from Sudbury who had spent 4 years as a firefighter, if I could train with her on weekends. She looked at me for a moment and then said yes without asking why. There was a retired staff sergeant who taught defensive tactics, a lean, patient man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw from an incident he never explained, and hands that told you he had done the work, not studied it. One evening, he found me alone on the training mat at 8:30, running a takedown sequence until my wrists ached. He sat on the bench at the edge of the mat and watched for a moment. You're not training to get better, he said. You're training to punish yourself into being good enough. There's a difference. The first one is sustainable. The second one burns out. He stood up slowly. Over his shoulder as he walked away, the ones who stay are the ones who train for something, not against something. I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about my father's arm dropping back to the armchair. I thought about who he had been before the injury, in the photograph on my wall that was now in a contractor bag. I started training for something. By graduation, the woman from BC who had given me 4 weeks was in my row in the troop photo. She didn't mention the bet. Neither did I. My first posting was a small detachment 4 hours north of Thunder Bay, where the roads went unpaved for long stretches and backup was 45 minutes away on a clear day. I learned to read a situation in the first 10 seconds. I learned that the job was mostly showing up, consistently, without drama, until people trusted you enough to tell you what was actually wrong. 3 winters in, I pulled a driver from a single vehicle accident on a bush road at -28. He had gone off the road and into a drainage ditch, the car tilted at 40 degrees, engine off, windshield gone. I got him up the embankment because his legs wouldn't hold, wrapped him in the emergency blanket from my kit, and kept him talking until the ambulance made it up the service road. He had a fractured collarbone and was heading into shock. He lived. Sitting in the detachment that night filing my report, I realized I hadn't thought once about whether I was capable. I had just done it. The case that changed everything came several years later, when I was transferred to a joint federal task force operating out of Ottawa. The work was complex, and I cannot discuss the details even now because the court files remain sealed. What I can tell you is that, at the end of 18 months, 41 people were home who should not have been where we found them. The commissioner issued commendation coins to the 53 officers on the task force, a restricted coin, not standard issue, with a specific insignia on one face that identified the operation. Only 53 of them existed in all of Canadian law enforcement. I kept mine on my keychain. 14 months after the task force concluded, I was crossing a parking garage in Nepean when I heard a man fall. He was coming out of the elevator, tall, gray suit, mid-stride, and then he simply wasn't standing anymore. I was 20 feet away. I ran. I initiated CPR on concrete at -14 degrees while two civil servants stood nearby on their phones. I kept the compressions steady, counted, kept going. His ribs shifted under my palms in that necessary, terrible way that means the work is real. When the paramedics arrived and took over, I stood up and stepped back and let them do their job. I didn't know his name. I didn't stay. What I didn't realize was that when I knelt down on that concrete, my keychain had pulled loose from my jacket pocket. The commendation coin had fallen. By the time the ambulance pulled away, it was lying in the unconscious man's hand. I didn't know that, not for years. The promotions came steadily. The rank insignia changed on my shoulders, and the ceremonies grew larger, and the family section at each one had a particular kind of silence, not empty. They always set out the reserved chairs with the little folded place cards, but claimed by no one. I watched other officers' parents come forward to pin on new insignia, watched the hugging and the photographs and the faces of people who had shown up. I developed a practiced way of looking slightly past those moments, like you are watching something just over the horizon that only you can see. A colleague who had been on the task force with me, a quiet, steady man who had been with the force longer than I'd been alive, pinned my new rank on at the superintendent ceremony without being asked, and he did not make it into a thing. That was the kindest way he could have done it. My old burner phone stayed charged in my kit bag. Every few months, late at night, it would ring. My father's voice came through the static, slower than it used to be, the words spaced carefully around his breathing. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart." He never called long. My mother did not know he had the phone. He kept it in his physiotherapy bag. I wired the next home care payment the same night every time, and I increased the amount incrementally each year as my salary allowed. The agency sent someone 3 times a week now. My mother had never asked where the supplemental coverage came from. She assumed it was government, some program she didn't understand. That was fine. Somewhere in those middle years, I stopped waiting for her to call. I stopped rehearsing the conversation I would have with her if she did. And I started studying her instead, her patterns, her motivations, the machinery underneath the performance, the way I would study an intelligence target. My mother had one true religion, the opinion of people she believed were above her. She curated her social world with the precision of a set designer, every affiliation and name drop chosen for what it communicated to the audience. Her deepest fear was not poverty. It was losing the story she told about herself to the people whose approval she had built her entire life around. If I confronted her privately, she would cry and make herself the victim of my ambition, my coldness, my inability to be grateful. She had done it my entire childhood and she had never stopped being good at it. My brother would confirm her version. My sister would vanish into her phone. I would be the difficult one again for the rest of everyone's life. But in a room full of people whose opinion was the architecture of her identity. In a room where I could not be dismissed. I waited. The envelope arrived at my office on a Thursday in March, heavy cream stock, embossed seal of the Solicitor General of Canada, the annual National P. Honours Gala, black tie, the Château Laurier Grand Ballroom, 850 guests. I unfolded the VIP attendee list and ran my finger down the columns until I stopped. She had registered under my father's name, listed herself as his accompanying spouse, retired RCMP constable, family of a 30-year distinguished service member, VIP table in the Family Honors section, reserved for immediate families of officers with 30 or more years. My father's 30 years, the same service she had described as a waste of a life, the same uniform she had asked him to take down from the wall. She was using his red sarge like a borrowed coat to walk through the front door of the world she had told me to abandon. I set the paper down. I pressed the tips of my fingers flat against my desk and breathed, 4 counts in, 8 counts out, the way you breathe before a decision that cannot be undone. I picked up my pen and circled the date. The morning of the gala, I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters for a long time. I buttoned the red serge slowly. The fabric was stiff and immaculate, heavier than it looks in photographs. I aligned the service mills on my left breast with care, each one a record of something that had required something. I picked up the rank insignia, the crossed batons and crown of a deputy commissioner, and pressed it into the fabric on both shoulders. The youngest female deputy commissioner in the force's history, I had not set out to be a record. Records are byproducts of not stopping. I squared my cap in the mirror, I breathed once more, and I walked out. The grand ballroom at the Château Laurier is built to make a certain kind of point. The ceiling vaults 3 stories above the floor. The chandeliers have been there longer than most of the careers in the room. When you walk through those doors in full dress uniform, the room adjusts, not dramatically, but structurally, the way a current shifts when something is introduced into it. I scanned the room as I walked in, sector by sector, the way I have scanned every room since my first winter posting, and found them in the family honors section near the front. My mother was in a champagne-colored dress that cost more than a month of my father's pension. She was leaning toward the woman on her right with the performed intimacy of someone working a room. My brother sat beside her in a tuxedo, cufflinks catching the light, the particular expression on his face of a man who believes he is exactly where he deserves to be. And at the far end of the table, my father. He was in a navy suit that had once fit him better than it did now. He had become smaller, the way people become smaller when a body has been carrying pain for a very long time. His hands rested on the white tablecloth. His eyes moved quietly across the room with the patience of someone who has learned to find something worth watching in any situation, because sometimes that is the only control available to you. Those eyes found mine. His face did something I had not seen in 22 years. It opened completely. I gave him a small nod, barely a dip of my chin, and continued toward the officer's table. I would not give her a scene. That was not what I had come for. But my mother has never in her life permitted someone else to control the story she is in. She stood up so quickly the chair screamed across the stone floor behind her. The sound cut through the nearest conversation like a blade. The jazz quartet lost the thread of the song. The room went quiet in that sideways way, everyone pretending not to look while looking. She stepped directly into the aisle in front of me. Her? Her voice was calibrated to carry. She reached back and closed her hand over my brother's arm with the theatrical pride of someone taking a curtain call. My son is the one who actually built something. He belongs here. She just wears the uniform to make herself look important. My brother stood. He looked at me across 10 feet of marble floor with 22 years of contempt in a single expression. He stepped forward, he drew his arm back and swung. The sound of his palm against my face was flat and very loud under that vaulted ceiling. You were never welcome here, he said. The heat spread across my cheekbone immediately. I did not raise my hand to it. I did not move my feet. I looked at him with the eyes of someone who has stood in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher than a gala on a Thursday evening, and I said nothing at all. Then the room came apart behind me. 300 chairs scraped backward across the stone floor in something close to unison. The sound of it was physical, felt in the chest before it registered in the ears. 300 RCMP officers, federal prosecutors, and senior officials rose as a single coherent entity. Their dress uniforms straightened, their spines locked, their eyes settled on my brother with the focused, categorizing attention of people who have spent careers assessing exactly this kind of situation. Every one of them was waiting. 2 plainclothes security officers were already moving up the aisle. A corporal had stepped into position 4 feet from my brother, who had gone completely still, the stillness of a man who has just understood the full geometry of what he has done. A federal prosecutor near the first row said, quietly and clearly, "That man just struck the deputy commissioner, detain him." My mother's wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound was almost gentle by comparison. Before the security officers completed their approach, a figure rose from the head table. He was older than I remembered. The hair fully white now, the face sharpened into finer lines by the years between. Retired Chief Justice Alderton, 74 years old, 43 years on the bench. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His hand went briefly to his chest as he drew a breath, a reflex involuntary, the gesture of someone whose sternum carries a specific memory. He held something between his thumb and forefinger. The chandelier caught it, a small coin, matte finish, particular insignia, not standard issue, not something you find anywhere but on the right person's keychain. 7 years ago, he said, and the room restructured itself around his voice the way courtrooms do. I had a cardiac event in a parking garage in Nepean. The temperature was -14. I was unconscious before I hit the concrete. He looked around the ballroom without hurry. One person stopped. She performed CPR for 11 minutes. She was gone before I regained consciousness. The paramedics found this in my hand. He held the coin higher. The murmur that moved through 300 RCMP officers was not polite. It was recognition, the kind that travels on a frequency that cannot be manufactured. It took me 5 years to trace that insignia. There are 53 of those coins in existence. Tonight is the first time I have been in the same room as the officer who carries the 53rd. He turned and pointed, directly, the way he had pointed at evidence for 40 years, at the task force commendation on my chest. "The woman you just called unimportant," he said to the room, "is the reason I am standing here." The silence lasted exactly 1 breath. Then the voices came. A superintendent 2 rows back stood up. She held the perimeter in Timmins when our team was a man short. We would have lost 2 people without the call she made. A retired inspector by the window. I know what she recovered on that task force. I won't say the number publicly, but every person in this room should know it's a number that matters. A young constable from somewhere near the back, his voice less polished but no less certain. She came to our detachment after we lost a member. Nobody sent her. She just showed up and she stayed for 3 days, and she didn't make it about anything except us. I don't know how she found out, but she did. The testimonies built and overlapped and fell over each other, not chaos but weight, each voice a stone, each name a debt that could not be spun or reframed or cried away. My mother's hands found the white tablecloth and gripped it. Her manicured fingers pulled and the cloth shifted. A water glass toppled and rolled off the edge. She was not looking at anyone. Her eyes had gone to a point somewhere between the floor and the wall, the specific expression of a person whose story about themselves has just been permanently rewritten in front of the audience she built her entire life around. My brother had been walked to the far side of the room by the security officers. His arms were behind his back. His face had gone the color of uncooked pastry. His cufflinks no longer caught the light. My sister had already disappeared. I caught a glimpse of the back of her gown through the corridor doorway, moving quickly, quietly, the way she had always moved when a room turned. She had learned that from the person who raised her. The Chief Justice crossed the floor toward me. He stopped and looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has had 7 years to prepare for this. He took my hand, turned it palm up, and placed the coin in it. He held my closed fist in both of his for a moment. "You drop this," he said quietly. "It's past time it came back." I did not speak to my mother. I had nothing left to prove to her. Every proof I could ever have offered had been offered already, in rooms and postings and situations she would never know and could not have endured, over 22 years during which her phone had never once rung to my number. My silence was not an absence, it was the sentence. I turned away from her and crossed the ballroom to the far end of the family honors table where my father sat. He had not moved through any of it. He had watched everything with the wet, still attention of a man who has spent a very long time in a room where he was not permitted to speak, watching someone finally speak for him. I crouched down in front of his chair. My medals pressed softly against my chest as I bent forward. I took his hands in mine, both of them, and his fingers closed around mine immediately, with a certainty that told me they had been waiting for exactly this. "Dad," I said. He could not speak for a moment. His face was carrying 22 years of things at once, and there was simply not enough room for words. When they came out quiet and fractured and entirely true. "I knew you'd come back." I put my arm around his shoulders. How light he had become. How much of him the years and the pain had quietly taken. He found his feet slowly, testing the floor the way you test ice, carefully, with the knowledge that it has failed you before, and then he found them, and he stood. We walked. The 300 officers who had risen from their chairs had not sat back down. They stood in 2 lines along the aisle. No one had ordered it, no one had asked. An honor corridor organized by the instinct of people who do this work long enough to understand when something real is happening, and when protocol simply hasn't arrived yet. Their backs were straight, their eyes were forward. Their silence was not empty, it was everything. As I stepped into that corridor with my father's arm over my shoulder, the first officer on the left came to attention. Then the next, then the line moved, a wave running down both sides of the aisle, formal and quiet and completely voluntary. Someone in the back started to clap. It was not gala applause, it was uneven and real, and it built in about 4 seconds from 1 pair of hands to 300. Boots stamped the stone floor. The chandeliers trembled with the vibration. An officer near the doorway turned away for a moment, and I saw his shoulders move, and I understood that, and I did not look. I kept my eyes on the doors. My father's hand tightened on my shoulder. We walked out of the Château Laurier and into the cold Ottawa night. Behind us, the sound of 300 people who had become Over 22 years of postings and funerals, and empty family sections and late-night phone calls, the only family that had ever chosen to show up. That sound followed us out into the dark and stayed with us long after the doors closed behind us. My brother was charged that night under Section 270 of the Criminal Code, assaulting a peace officer. The proceedings were not private. The firm on Bay Street managed the news the way firms manage news that cannot be managed, quietly, and then he was no longer there. My sister sent a message 3 weeks later. I read it once, I did not reply. My father lives with me now. We have a house in the West End with a physiotherapist who comes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and in the evenings we drink tea, and sometimes he tells me stories about his postings that I had never heard, the ones he had not been allowed to tell when she was in the room. He is slower now, and some days are harder than others, but he is free in the way that only people who have been held somewhere for a long time can understand the word free. The Chief Justice's coin sits on my desk. I move the task force commendation coin beside it. The most powerful thing I ever learned, not at Depot, not in the North, not in any briefing room, is this. The people who try to erase you from their story cannot remove you from the real one. The real one is written in every room you actually entered, every hand you actually held, every distance you actually crossed. That story belongs to you. It always did. If you know what it costs to build something true, while the people who should have believed in you were busy explaining why you wouldn't make it. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, who tried to write you out of their story, and how did you write yourself back into your own?